Welcome to this video series on Geotechnical Hazard Awareness, created for both surface and underground mining environments. This is the third video in the series, and today we'll be diving deeper into three critical concepts that help us understand why rock masses fail: cohesion, friction, and the stresses acting on natural breaks within the rock. As a quick refresher, these natural breaks, also known as discontinuities, include features like joints, faults, fractures, and bedding planes. Understanding how these features behave under stress is essential for designing safer mines and predicting where instability might occur. When assessing the stability of a rock mass, whether in a surface or underground mine, it is essential to understand why a particular section of rock holds together or fails. Three key properties that are part of what help geotechnical engineers answer that question are cohesion, friction, and stress. These three aren't just academic components of sheer strength. They are part of what directly influences whether a mined rock surface remains intact, slowly deforms, or suddenly collapses. Even when there's pressure pushing down on the rock, some materials naturally resist breaking or sliding apart. This built-in strength comes from a combination of cohesion, the internal bonding that holds the rock together; friction, the resistance between surfaces trying to slide past one another; and stress, the forces acting on or within the rock due to gravity, mining activity, or natural geological conditions. By understanding how each one of these contributes to the overall behavior of the rock, we can make better decisions, whether we're designing an open pit wall, excavating underground, or interpreting monitoring data. This knowledge helps us predict where failure might occur, and more importantly, how to manage or prevent it. Let's now dive in by talking about cohesion. Cohesion is a measure of the internal strength that holds a rock mass together, even when there's no pressure from above. It comes from the natural bonding between particles, grains, or crystals in the rock, and it helps resist separation along surfaces like joints, fractures, or bedding planes. You can think of it as a kind of internal stickiness. In some rocks, minerals act like cement, gluing everything together. In others, tiny interlocking crystals create a tight bond. This natural cohesion plays a key role in the short-term stability of exposed rock surfaces after excavation or blasting. At a mine site, we often see the effect of cohesion when an excavation exposes rock surfaces. Even in the absence of support, some walls, backs, or pillars appear to stand firm for a time. That initial stability, especially in fresh, unweathered rock, can be partly attributed to cohesion working alongside other forces like friction and confinement. But here's the part that's easy to overlook. Cohesion isn't constant. When a rock is freshly exposed, it may still have strong internal bonds, like the suction you can sometimes encounter with a newly opened jar of peanut butter. But over time, that stickiness that you first encountered can break down. Blasting can fracture the cementation. Moisture can weaken clay bonds or dissolve mineral glues. Cycles of stress or vibration can slowly degrade the interlocking between grains. Weathering or chemical reactions can reduce the cohesive strength, especially near the surface. So what can the resulting outcome be? A rock face that initially looked stable may start to unravel. That's why ongoing workplace inspections are critical, because what holds together today may not tomorrow. Even in competent rock, a drop in cohesion can tip the balance and lead to instability, especially when combined with changes in stress or loss of confinement. So why does cohesion matter? Because it's one of the first lines of defense in preventing rock mass failure. And because it is often invisible, you can't always tell by looking. Understanding it means we can better understand how once stable rock surrounding workplaces at a mine site can change over time. Let's take a look at how we might understand cohesion from what we already know. Imagine you're building something with sand, like a sandcastle. If the sand is completely dry, it falls apart in your hand. But if the sand is a little bit wet, it holds its shape. You can stack it up, carve it, and even build walls. That's cohesion in action. The water helps bind the grains together, just like natural minerals or bonds do in rock. On a mine site, you may not see cohesion directly, but you can see its effects in clay-rich materials that hold their shape when moist, but fall apart when they dry. Or soft rock that initially blasts smoothly and initially appears stable, but then starts to crumble over time. So like a sandcastle made with just the right moisture, cohesive strength can help stabilize things, but if it changes, such as the sand drying, it can all fall apart. Our next topic to review is friction. Friction is the resistance to sliding that occurs when two surfaces are pressed together. In geotechnical terms, it's one of the most important forces that helps prevent movement along a joint, fracture, or bedding plane. When rock surfaces come into contact, like two blocks sitting against each other, friction is a bit like a car brake, as it resists the force trying to make one part of the rock mass move or slide past another. The rougher and more interlocked the surfaces are, the more friction they generate, or the potential greater resistance to sliding. The smoother and more polished they are, the easier it is for them to slip. Friction is a critical part of shear strength, or the rock's ability to resist movement. Even if a joint has no cohesion at all, friction alone can sometimes be enough to keep it stable, especially if it's tightly closed or interlocked. At a mine site, friction can be inferred by how the exposed rock surface looks and feels. So, the clues that we look for in the rock include the shape, the texture, and sometimes the shine. When you see a joint or fracture that's rough, stepped, or jagged, that's a good sign. These surfaces tend to interlock, which helps resist movement. You might see angular edges, ridges, or tooth-like grooves, especially on fresh blast surfaces. These surfaces catch against each other. They don't slide easily. That's high friction. Now, on the other hand, if you see smooth, flat surfaces, like bedding planes, or especially flat surfaces that look like they've been polished, that's a sign of lower friction, and that smoothness means there's less resistance to sliding. Sometimes you'll see soft, muddy materials in fault zones or joints, what we call fault gouge or clay. These act like natural lubricants between the rock surfaces. In those zones, friction is very low, and the risk of movement is high. But roughness isn't just about how grippy the surface feels. It also depends on the shape of the surface. Is it wavy, smooth, or polished? A wavy surface makes it harder to slide, just like a car needs more effort to go over a speed bump. And moisture plays a role too. Wet surfaces, especially when there's clay or mud involved, are much more slippery. It's a bit like how a car tire slides on ice. The shape of the car tire itself hasn't changed, but the conditions around it have. However, it is important to note that even the scale matters. An individual broken rock may look like it has a rough broken edge to it, but when you step back and look at the full rock face, that same break along the individual rock might run continuously for meters as a flat sliding surface. So what could look grippy in your hand might not be safe when it scales up. In short, rougher, drier, cleaner, and tightly closed rock surfaces tend to have higher friction and resist movement better. Smoother, wetter, or clay-coated surfaces are more likely to slide, especially under stress. And yes, friction can change. Movement, such as fault movement, can polish surfaces. Blasting can cause disruptions to how surfaces interlock. Water can seep into fractures, and sediment or clay builds up in breaks within the rock over time. So what was once stable may no longer be. That's why inspecting rock surfaces and understanding what you're really looking at is critical. Now, let's look at some examples that you are familiar with at work or possibly at home. Imagine you're walking along a rough, uneven floor in an underground mine. You're wearing steel-capped boots with textured soles. The ground is made up of coarse, crushed rock and compacted fines. As you take a step, the tread of your boots presses into the rough surface of the ground and you feel stable, steady. Because of this high friction, your boot grips the ground well and you don't slip. Now imagine if the rocky ground was replaced with a polished wooden floor, and your sturdy steel-capped boots were gone, leaving you wearing pink, fluffy socks. In this case, there's very low friction between your socks and the floor, and it would be very easy to slip. Let's now talk about how friction actually feels, and why some surfaces resist sliding more than others, even when you're using the same amount of force. We're going to use an analogy of holding two smooth tiles or two fine-grained pieces of sandpaper together. You try to rub the pieces together to get them slide across one another. At first, there's a bit of resistance. The fine textures on the surface still try to catch on each other. But because the grains are small and fairly smooth, so with a little push they slide over each other. Then if you add some dust or a small amount of water, they slide even more easily. That's because the debris fills the tiny gaps between the grains and reduces the interlocking capacity of the surface, effectively lowering the friction. This is like a smooth rock joint where sliding is possible, especially if there's moisture or mineral infill between the surfaces. Now switch those materials to two coarse bricks or two pieces of coarse sandpaper. The moment you try to rub rough surfaces together, you feel serious resistance. The larger jagged grains are locking together, and they easily resist moving when using the same force as before. You can't easily the surfaces to slide without either tearing the coarse interlocking grains or applying a lot more force. This mimics a rough interlocked rock joint that has high friction and therefore strong resistance to movement, unless enough force is applied. Now we shall talk about the final piece of this particular puzzle. Let's talk about stress. When we talk about shear strength in rock, we're really asking, how much force can this rock handle before it starts to slide or fall apart? Now, one of the key ingredients in the types of stress that can act on a rock is something called normal stress, and not the kind you feel at the start of a shift or on a Monday morning. We're talking about how much force is holding the rock in place. Let's break that down. Imagine two pieces of rock pressed together along a crack or a break, such as a joint, a fault, or a fracture. This is a clamping force, and it can actually help hold things together, especially if the surface is rough or jagged. The more pressure, the more those little bumps and grooves lock into each other, kind of like Velcro. But even if the rock is clamped tight with good cohesion and rough friction between the surfaces, there are external forces that can mess with all of that. Things like blast vibrations from nearby drilling or blasting, seismic events, natural or mining-induced, gravity pulling rock downward, and the weight of overlying rock pressing from above. These forces can reduce the clamping pressure, shake the surface loose, or even overcome the cohesion and friction that are holding it together. So, the stress that acts on a break in the rock essentially comes in three forms. The first two that I will talk about fall under the term normal stress, which simply means it's any stress that acts perpendicular to a surface. The first type of normal stress is a compression style, which is like a clamping force. It's a technical way of describing how much pressure is being applied directly onto a surface, like a straight-on push or squeeze. Imagine holding a book firmly between the palms of your hands. The harder you press, the more you're squeezing the book at right angles to its surface, locking it in place so it can't move. That's normal stress. In rock, the same idea applies. When compressive stress increases, it presses the sides of a crack or joint together, making it harder for the rock to slip or fall apart. But if that clamping pressure drops, the rock loses that grip and movement becomes easier. So in short, compressive stress is a type of normal stress, and it is the pressure that holds things together, like squeezing a book shut with your hands. The more pressure, the more secure it is. Less pressure, the less secure. Now that leads us to talking about the second type of stress that acts perpendicular to a break. This is tensile stress. Tensile stress is the opposite of compression. So, instead of pressing the book together, imagine slowly pulling your hands apart, removing that clamping force. Eventually, the book slips and falls. Tensile stress pulls the sides of a crack away from each other, creating space where things can open up and break apart. In a rock, this makes it easier for failure to occur because there's no pressure holding it shut. No grip, no friction, just separation. Now finally, we have the third and final stress that we are looking at today, which is shear stress. This is the force that tries to slide one part of the rock past the other. Now picture placing two books on top of each other. Keep one hand on the top book and one on the bottom, and try to slide them in opposite directions. That's essentially shear stress. It's not pulling apart or pressing in, it's trying to slip one surface over the other. So to recap, compressive stress is the squeeze. It clamps the pages together. Tensile stress is the pull. It lets the book fall open. Shear stress is the shove. It tries to slide the books past each other. So, whether the books or the rock can resist movement depends on three things. How rough the surfaces are, that's friction. How well they stick together, that's cohesion. And how tightly they're pressed together, that's the normal stress. And the balance of these tells us whether a break in the rock will stay locked or let go. That's the end of the third video in this series. As always, thank you for watching, and come back again next week for the next video.